There are some features missing from the M50 Mark II that might mean that you shouldn't buy it. It's not a perfect camera, and to be fair, no camera is, but there are some specific features that I wanted to see added to this one that I think would have made it a better value, even at a higher cost. Now, I just published a video telling you why you should buy the Canon M50 Mark II, because for the majority of users, it checks a lot of the boxes for what actually matters. Today, I'm gonna tell you what I think is missing from the M50 Mark II, and we'll talk about a few other options that I think you should consider if those features are important to you. The first feature is 4K for video. If you're planning on shooting in 4K, the M50 Mark II is not a camera that I would recommend. Yes, it is possible to shoot 4K at 24 frames per second, so it is technically able to do that, but the autofocus is slower and it's less reliable. They did add eye autofocus, but it's still a contrast detection system rather than the face detection dual pixel autofocus that we're getting in 1080p, and overall it's just not as good. There's also an additional 1.7x crop in 4K, which makes it much more difficult to get wide angle shots. Finally, the 4K is not quite as sharp as what you get with the Sony cameras like the a61, 64, and 6600 because we're not getting a full sensor readout. And there's also no option for 4K at 30 frames per second. Now, whether you actually need 4K is a separate conversation altogether, but if you've got your mindset, if you're sitting here saying, Sugi, I gotta have 4K no matter what, I would probably skip the M50 Mark II. And since we're on the topic of resolution and frame rate, I also wanna mention slow motion. So the way to get slow motion on a camera is to record at a higher frame rate than what you'll edit and play back in. So for example, if you film in 60 frames per second and then play it back at 24 frames per second, you can stretch that 1 second of recording time into 2.5 seconds of play time. And that way you're getting 2.5 times slow motion. A lot of cameras offer 120 frames per second, so you can slow that footage down even more. And when most people think of slow motion, that's sort of the minimum. And the M50 Mark II can only do 60 frames per second at 1080p. And if you want to go to 120 frames per second, then you have to bring down the resolution to 720p. Now on top of that, there's no autofocus, digital image stabilization, or audio recorded when you're in that shooting mode. So is it usable? Yes. But would I get this camera if I was thinking of shooting a lot of slow motion? I wouldn't. Now let's talk about the EFM lens mount. Like I said in my other video, it's true that there are more options available now than when the original M50 was released. We've got the Sigma Trio and the Viltrox Trio, but there's still no fast zoom options. We don't have anything that's comparable to like a 24 to 70 f2.8 or a 70 to 200 f2.8, and every available zoom lens has a variable maximum aperture. Now there are rumors of 5 new lenses that were supposed to come out in 2020, and we may see in 2021 due to what's going on in the world. And that list includes a 15mm f2, a 50mm f2, a 60mm f4 macro IS, an 18 to 45 f2.8 to f4 IS, and a 100 to 300 f5.6 to f8. The 18 to 45 will help, but it still looks like if we want the best performance, we have to go to a different lens mount. And that's really the second part of the equation here. If you're buying the M50 Mark II as part of a progression, meaning that you want to start with an APS-C sensor camera and then move on to full frame, then you might struggle with your lens choices because Canon has so many different lens mounts. Personally, I think that most people don't need full frame sensor cameras and probably don't want to spend the type of money that those full frame lenses cost. For the majority of what I do, I use APS-C or Super 35 sensor cameras, but if you want full frame in the future, here's the problem. Canon's full frame mirrorless cameras use the RF mount, and that means that if you want to buy lenses that will work on your M50 Mark II, and then also something like the EOS R, RP, or the newer R6 or R5, you'll need to buy EF mount lenses and then use an adapter. And that means that you're committing to always using an adapter if you want to use those lenses, even when you upgrade to full frame. It also means that you can't invest in RF lenses now and then only upgrade the body because RF lenses can't be adapted to the M50 Mark II. With my Sony cameras, because both the APS-C and full frame sensor cameras use the E-mount, I can buy full frame lenses and then use them on both types of cameras. And technically, if I had cinema cameras from Sony, I could use them on that as well. So if you want to move on to a full frame camera, the M50 Mark II doesn't have the cleanest upgrade path. And remember what I said, I don't think that most people need full frame, and the price of RF lenses is very high, which is actually true for very good full frame lenses from any brand. If you're still here and have gotten value from this video, give it a thumbs up. It very much helps the video and the channel, and it lets me know what kind of content you like so that I can make more of it. And I still see that over 90% of you aren't subscribed yet, so hit that subscribe button. The next feature that I really wish Canon had added to the M50 Mark II is animal eye autofocus. Now, I photograph my dogs a lot, and I can't tell you how much easier my life has been since I got a few cameras with animal eye autofocus. I just turn it on and then I can shoot my dogs and I never actually have to think about autofocus. Now without it, I was using spot autofocus, but then I had to make sure that I got it right on their eye because zone-based autofocus would often focus on their nose since it's closer to the camera. If you take a lot of pictures of your pets, I'm telling you, it's definitely a feature that you should try out. Next, I want to talk about battery life, which was definitely a weakness of the M50. With the M50 Mark II, Canon improved the battery life from 235 shots to 305. It's close to a 30% improvement, but I would have really liked to see them use an LPE17 battery and then bump that up even more. If you're looking for some improved battery solutions, I do have 2 videos that I know will help you, and I'll put them in the description. Now, the next feature that I was hoping for was an additional dial. The M50 Mark II only has a single dial, so you can control either the aperture or the shutter speed, then you have to use another button on the back to toggle back and forth. I would have loved to see an additional dial on the back, which would have really improved ergonomics when shooting photos. It's not that big a deal for me when I'm doing video because I very rarely change my shutter speed, so I can just leave it on aperture. But for photography, it's really nice to be able to quickly control exposure with multiple dials. The next feature has to do with audio, and it's one that a lot of people don't think about until they realize they need it. So the M50 Mark II does not show you your audio levels while you're recording. Now, this could be a deal breaker for some people because you can't tell if your audio is too low or if it's clipping in real time. You can switch to a different screen display option on the LCD and see the levels, but then you can't actually see what the camera is recording. Now, it's really strange to me that you can't see both because obviously they're able to show you both, and I'm not sure why they didn't include it as a display option. Now, we do have clean HDMI output with the M50 Mark II, something that was not available on the original M50, so we're able to connect an external monitor and then view and monitor audio levels that way. Now, cameras like the Z50 or the Sony a6100 do have that feature built in, and hopefully Canon can include it in a future firmware update. Like I mentioned in my previous Canon M50 Mark II video, I think this camera is an excellent option as long as the features that I mentioned so far are not deal breakers for you. I hope this video helped you make a buying decision. Click on my face to subscribe to the channel and then check out one of these other related videos. You know what I always say, buy it nice or buy it twice. Good luck and see you soon.